Welcome back to this almost final part of the day. Just to remind you, after this, it's not over. We will be treated to wonderful music and refreshments outside on the patio. So please stay for that after this, what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion. And then also you can warm up. I'd like to apologize for the energy waste here in this room because it's very, very cold, but the air conditioning system has been turned down. And if the panel is passionate enough now, then I think we can raise the temperature in this room a couple of degrees. But welcome again. My name is Margot Gerritsen. I'm a professor in energy resources engineering on the campus, and it's my absolute pleasure to moderate the panel with three fantastic people on it. And it's just so nice to have three big brains to discuss some more of the issues that have come up. So I'd like to just introduce them very quickly, starting with Don Kennedy here. Don is incredibly illustrious, and my history with Don started when I came to Stanford as a PhD student. Don was president. So for me, I mean, just to be at very close distance to him now is quite something. So he's a president emeritus of Stanford University. He's the Bing Professor of Environmental Science and Policy emeritus. He's also, for example, the editor-in-chief of the Science magazine. And there's so many accolades I could mention, but let me just mention one that I particularly like, and that he won the Carl Sagan Prize for Science Popularization at Wonderfest, and that is wonderful. So thanks very much, Don, for joining us. He has many interests, and a lot of them are interdisciplinary. And if there's one thing that you got out of today, I'm sure, is that all of the problems that we've been discussing, food and energy and water and climate, they're all very strongly interconnected. So it means that when you research them, you have to really have a very strong interdisciplinary look. And Don is one of those people. He looks at land use changes. He looks at economically driven alterations in agricultural practice. So we'll I'm sure, talk about this. He's also very interested in development of regulatory politics and in global climate change. So welcome, Don Kennedy. Thank you. Thank you. And next to Don is Roz Naylor. Roz is the director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment, FSE. She's also a professor in environmental earth system sciences and associate professor of economics. And she is advisor in many, many different places I just mentioned. She's on the scientific advisory board of Bayer Institute in Stockholm. She's on the advisory panel for African human development at the United Nations, and the list goes on. Roz and I met a couple of years ago when I was interviewing her for a podcast. And I just so much enjoyed the discussion with her. She's really an expert on food security. She looks a lot at impacts of all sorts of areas on food and food supply. She looks at food supply for developing countries as well as any impacts that decisions we make here in the United States have on foreign countries. And it's wonderful to have her on the panel. So thanks very much, Roz, for joining us. And then on the far end is my colleague, Adam Brandt. He is a professor in energy resources engineering. He has been with us now for 4 years, I think. It's been absolutely wonderful. Adam is a very courageous person because he says, I want to do a apples to apples, fair comparison of energy resources. I want to understand the whole picture of an energy resource, not just one particular aspect, but everything, and look at linkages with, for example, food, and all these dots that we've been connecting. Adam really connects that in his research. So he does something called an energy system analysis, but a full energy system analysis. He has a research group called the Environmental Assessment and Optimization Group. He likes to use his knowledge of these systems to improve efficiency of energy systems. And he emphasizes this rigorous and fair analysis of economic and environmental impacts of energy resources. And this is a very new field. It's become more and more important, and Adam really has become one of the pioneers in this field. So Adam, thanks very much for joining us, and I'm sure you will contribute greatly. Right. So one of the wonderful things about being a moderator of a panel is that I can start with asking questions. And one of the issues, of course, that have come up as we talk this afternoon is that everything now is not only interconnected, so we have all these dots that are connected, but also it seems that every decision we make is actually has global impact. So it's very hard at this time to make a decision in the United States without impacting another country. And I'd like to emphasize this a little bit in this first part of the discussion. I want to start with you, Ross, because a couple of years ago when we were talking, you mentioned the tortilla crisis, and you've made me aware that a lot of the decisions that we would make in the United States, for example, in agriculture and food supply will have repercussions elsewhere. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the tortilla crisis that you're referring to goes back to David's talk, and with the biofuels, the corn-based biofuels, when we're using 40% of our corn in biofuels, we're not trading it and we're not putting it into the international market, and that's caused prices to go up for staple commodities. And it's not just corn, it's substitutes in production. Farmers grow more corn and less soybeans, so soybean prices go up. Livestock producers can't get corn at a reasonable price, they use wheat, and wheat prices go up. Developing countries look at wheat versus rice. Wheat prices are high, so they switch to rice. Rice prices go up. The economics, all these markets are interconnected. So you see these huge spillovers and effects kind of going all around the country. What's interesting, I was thinking with David's talk actually, was biofuels is very small in the total fuel and energy picture, especially even with the renewable fuels. But if you look at transportation fuels, it's actually 10%, it's E10. We use it as an oxygenate, and we've also mandated it into our renewable fuel standard. So it is significant in that sense. And I think it's not just how we're using our fuel, but the policies behind this that are so interesting, because we're holding on to this renewable fuel standards despite the fact that we see prices go up. Yes. Guatemala was in the news in a major way earlier because corn prices were so high, and it's one of the world's most malnourished places, on the planet. And but despite that, we hold on to this renewable fuel standards because our representation is so high in the Midwest. And the irony of it actually is that we have had to sort of forego some of our cellulosic advanced fuel mandates because we haven't gotten there technologically. But we still do have some advanced mandates in there, and we're seeing that we're producing enough ethanol that we're up against a blending wall, and we have too much of it. We're exporting it to Brazil, but to meet the advanced biofuel mandates, we're importing sugar-based ethanol from Brazil. And so we're seeing, if we talked about trade and what it means in terms of spillovers, it's not just what we're doing, but the policies behind it, I think, that are causing spillovers all over the planet.
So just sticking with biofuels for a while, I want to ask Don a question, because David mentioned this 40% number, which seems really large, and I know I was in the audience and I heard a lot of people say, "Oh, I didn't know this; it was so big." But a lot of people also believe that this is a part of a corn lobby. It's the agricultural industries that have been lobbying for subsidies and so on, and for this production. So Don, do you want to respond to that? Could we even now say, hey, we don't like this large ethanol production, let's just get rid of it? How much is this ingrained in our current agriculture?
I've been trying to think every once in a while about what good the corn ethanol program did for us. It clearly lowered the suicide rates in Iowa, I suppose. But it did do one thing. it probably reduced by at least 6 or 8 cents, $6 or $8 a barrel, the price of oil, because there were actually comments from Saudi Arabia, from the sheiks, that they really didn't like what was going on here with the U.S. biofuel commitment, because that, in fact, affects the new steep part of the price and oil demand curve. And so I think that probably was a significant factor. I really enjoyed David's talk, and one of the other things I liked particularly about it was that he emphasized the complexity of the different energetic inputs by inviting us to examine a new slice of toast. First of all, you heat it in your toaster, but of course, before it got to your toaster, an awful lot of food raising went into it, and various energetic commitments went into it. And so you got the impression that if you wanted to find the most interconnected piece of this interconnection of dots, you might nominate food. I was for natural gas as the most interconnected person, but food might have the case.
So Adam, have you researched the toast?
I haven't looked at toast. No, I quite enjoyed that, though. That was a good example of the kinds of thinking that's required to answer these questions: life cycle thinking, systems thinking, thinking about impacts that aren't direct but are indirect, that happen all the way to the wheat field and the bakery and everything that's required to make toast or anything else we use.
So one of the other issues that really comes out, and I think maybe the biggest one that we're facing, and every single talk mentioned this, is China and India, and the problem that we have there. It's a global problem, when we talk about energy and food and water and climate change as a result. So Adam, I know you've thought a little bit about this too, and particularly thought about export, for example, of coal to China, which was mentioned also in the talks before. So I wanted to ask all three of you what you think the best thing is that we can do in the United States to help China and India with their amazing energy problem. Adam.
Yeah, sure, I can start. This is a really interesting question. This also comes back to the discussion we had in the breakout session about the Keystone Pipeline. We're really at an unprecedented time in human history with incredible increases in standard of living over the last decade. We might not see it here in the United States, so it doesn't seem apparently obvious, but the average person is much better off. The average person on the planet is much better off now than they were 10 years ago. Much wealthier on average, et cetera, right? And a lot of this has come with increased energy demand. One of the challenges with trying to understand, like I do, trying to understand environmental impacts in this interconnected system, is that it's really hard to separate out, one piece from another. So I can give a pretty concrete example from that, from a policy context where the rubber is really hitting the road, so to speak. I do some advising and tool building for regulatory processes. I work for the California state government. It's one of my research projects. We've got a contract with them, and we're trying to build a tool that's the first tool to rigorously and transparently assess the greenhouse gas impacts of different oil options. One of the challenges with this tool and applying this tool for the California regulatory context is what they call the crude shuffling problem. So what this tool does is California uses it to assign a carbon intensity to different transportation fuels that we might use. Oil sands, for example, get a higher number than like a light sweet crude. The problem with us in California, trying to regulate the carbon intensity of our fuels is if we in California say we don't want a high carbon fuel like the oil sands, we're willing to pay less for it or they have to pay a tax. There's great concern that these fuels will essentially just go to these growing markets. And therefore the sort of overall global carbon problem won't be solved. And this is something that Mike Wara brought up with respect to the natural gas coal transition. So I think it's very hard in these complex problems to tease out what one thing you can do. The most obvious, I think, is efficiency and demand reduction. The U.S. consumes a lot of energy per capita. We use a lot more energy than other people in other places in the world. And so, if people in China and India are going to become more wealthy, which I think they are, one of the things we could really do to help them do this is to increase our efficiency, reduce our demand, and sort of free up supplies for other people.
Okay. Ross, yeah.
I definitely don't have an answer to this question, but I thought about it a lot because China, for example, with their energy, I always think about the water, energy, food kind of context here. And in the United States, I went to one of the breakout sessions that was talking about water and energy, and the big water user was going to be the biofuel sector because you have to have water to grow the crops and then, into the processing and so forth. But in the US, we hardly irrigate those crops. Corn is only maybe 20% irrigated out of Nebraska. Colorado, most of it's not irrigated, so it's rainfall, not a real opportunity cost. But go over to China, and actually the agriculture really depends on water very, very seriously, but the coal really depends on water too, and I see that to be a huge, huge trade-off there. How they deal with their energy sector is really going to also determine what happens with their food sector, I think, in terms of water availability. You see in China already moving water from the Yangtze up to the Yellow, and that's for a major irrigation area as well. And there are huge spillover effects with this because if they can't get water this way, they're also going up into the Himalayas, and there's a number of trade-offs there regionally into other parts of South Asia and so forth. But if they can't get irrigation and they can't get the food that they need with water, if the coal is taking that water, going over to Africa and so forth is going to become more likely, and then causing a number of other competitions within the food system that's virtual water. So I see it's so interconnected. I don't really have a solution to China's energy problem, though, except for maybe on the, also on the efficiency and going towards less, energy sources that would use resources less intensely.
Don.
I have two. One might be teach fracking in China, because exporting that technology could be rather helpful. But of course, the whole debate about whether we should export Powder River Basin coal to China raises its own kind of interesting questions. In China, the problem is that they mine coal in the boonies, but they burn it along the coast for the most part. And so if you did export that kind of coal, you would produce, first of all, some public health benefits if their public health ministry is aware about the history of the acid rain problem in the United States and recognizes that they have one. It's an advantage from that point of view. So it would be a substantial public health benefit, as well as a plausible solution in terms of supplying energy that both is better in terms of acid rain liability, which they're conscious of, and in terms of public health.
Great. Well, I've been a little bit selfish here and asking questions, but I know that a lot of you have questions burning in your mind. So I'd like to maybe now open the floor up to questions. And we have, again, mics going around. So if you want to ask a question to the panel, please raise your hand, and then I'm sure a mic will get to you. Yeah. There.
Lee is so living on the microphone.
We've talked a lot about different kinds of fuel sources and energy technologies today, and each has its pluses and minuses. And in particular, they will have pluses and minuses with respect to different life cycle impact categories, such as global warming potential, water footprint, land use, emissions to air, et cetera, et cetera. So is it sensible, and is it possible to create, say, a single parameter, if you will, that is some kind of weighted version of these different things? So for example, if you imagine that I'm like the the chief bean counter of the Department of Energy, right? I have a finite amount of money, and I'm trying to invest in these different energy technologies, right? I want to I want to rank order these technologies in terms of which is most environmentally friendly, so I can figure out how to invest my pot of money. And remember, I'm a bean counter, I'm not technical, and I just want that one number that I can use to evaluate and rank them. What would that look like? What would go into that?
Adam, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can talk about that.
That's you. He is our bean counter.
Yeah, so I'm the bean counter. There's a variety of ways of doing that. There's sort of a formal science to this called life cycle assessment, where you use large databases to compute impacts across, not just direct impacts, but across the entire economy. So sort of tracing this David's piece of bread all the way back to the wheat fields and the fertilizer and the water and the tractors. So there's a formal science to this. There's a variety of, and there's actually a whole area of the academic world that focuses on how to construct these aggregate or sort of single indicators, because this is something that decision makers want. There's a lot of controversy there. I don't want to get into it. There's controversy because it's hard to trade these things off. How do you trade off land use for water use? How do you trade off greenhouse gases for land impacts, species diversity impacts? Some of the newer tools integrate social impacts and these other sorts of measures of human well-being. Anytime you try and reduce things to a single number, you lose information, and there's embedded value systems and decisions made in that reduction. So there's literally dozens of them that have been proposed and they're used, and people sometimes will compare how these different indicators we'll compare coal to natural gas and say, let's look at a couple different aggregate indicators and see how they stack up. But yeah, it's an open area. There's no one answer, and there's lots of opinions about what's the best way to do this.
Just a second, because you don't have a mic. She's asking.
She asked which ones I find more sensible. I actually don't end up using them much in my research. I end up doing mostly greenhouse gas analysis. So I don't have a strong opinion one way or another, but I know people who do this have various opinions about it.
Any of the other panel members wanting to comment on this?
Well, if you're making technology bets, I would encourage you to consider at least creating the expectation that carbon capture and sequestration technology can be brought to a point at which it can be available to us before we finally get rid of coal.
Okay. Next question. Yeah.
Let me thank you all for a wonderful presentation. I feel terribly informed by all of the things that I have heard today. I'm going to ask a rather mischievous question. My perception is that we are facing several parallel incompetences. We are facing incompetence in agriculture going back 150 years. We are facing incompetence politically in policy making, because every time we decide on something, the ramifications go everywhere that we didn't expect. We are facing incompetence in finance management, economic management, in that we are creating incentives that are driving us into instabilities. And so my question is simply, which incompetence do you feel is most problematic?
The other person's incompetence. But Don, you want to start with this question?
It's the lawyers. No.
He didn't even bring up the lawyers.
Don't take me even the least bit seriously. I love them. I'm married to one. What can I tell you? I think the problems of management that really takes into account the kinds of consequences that so regularly happen to B when you move A or C when you move D, our capacity for looking at these intersectional effects is probably the weakest side of what we try to do.
I would put my vote in for the policy-making process right now. In fact, Margot and I were talking earlier about if you were the boss, what would you do? And she was saying, I would just wipe out the Senate and Congress. You know, that would be the easiest thing. You know?
You were not supposed to divulge that, Raj.
But it's true. You know,
all those in favor?
Yeah. You know, I mean, it certainly goes to, you know, gets connected to the financial mess. But on the agriculture, there are a zillion new and better ways of doing things. I mean, there's so many options and so much innovation in that field. It's just astounding. But why do we stay, you know, we're not stuck in one track, but we are politically. I mean, even if you look at the Farm Bill right now in process, we get stuck in the commodity program still, or we get stuck in insurance to deal with the climate rather than taking on climate, because, you know, it would be the best allies on the climate would be the farmers in the Midwest who are just getting killed on this. But if they get insurance payments based on either production or price, you know, they're going to be quiet, you know, because they'll probably be richer this way no matter what, you know. But it's the policy process that keeps us from really allowing the incentives for a lot of the innovation in the field I know best. And I'm sure you guys can think of similar ones on the energy, water, and so forth side. I think, unfortunately, we're mired in some heavy loads there.
I mean,
Lee, you had there's another question there.
Great discussion today, thank you. Question is about natural capital and valuing it. And I get the sense that there are many groups and discussions now, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and others, that are really looking at metrics for valuing ecosystem services. And my question is, do you think that with something, say, as simple as an accounting change that might allow companies to explicitly define the natural capital they so depend upon to run their businesses and show that as, say, a capital asset where a cost to deal with an externality like the cost of pollution control could be not so much an expense but an investment in natural capital? Whether those kinds of issues are ones that you're looking at here and, you know, connecting the dots among the legal and business and scientific issues you're looking at? I know it's a broad question, but it's just one in terms of measurement and how businesses might internalize some of these externalities that they're causing.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I mean, just more generally, the fact that a lot of our progress has been measured by economic growth is part of why we're sort of in this overall mess and trajectory that we're in right now. And I think your question of measuring it in terms of capital assets and so forth is great on the business side and the private sector side, because, you know, right now, well, even negative externalities are seen as positive economic growth in a way, and so the incentives are sort of backwards, right? And I can think of a lot on agriculture too, and sort of just capturing the nitrogen that would flow off these farms and utilizing all the inputs more efficiently, including water and nutrients and so forth. Do you guys have other examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's one example that comes to mind is a group called Carbon Tracker out of the UK, and I've seen some presentations by them, and one of the things they're trying to do is get groups that are valuing fossil fuel producers to recognize the possible limitations to the reserves in the ground. So the question is, are large coal producers or large oil producers, should they be able to book all those reserves? What if a climate regulation comes along that effectively prevents them from using all of those reserves at some point? And so that's you know, an example of trying to get you know, environmental considerations put into, or at least, you know, with some sort of uncertainty attached to it, but environmental considerations put into the valuation of companies, and you know, certainly that may be a lever, you know, for causing people to think differently about how to value things.
As a sometime regulator, when I concentrated on our capacity to monetize external costs, I now think it ought to be equally fair to attempt to monetize for the benefit of producers, the benefits that they have, that the external benefits that they produce for society. You shouldn't have it one way but not the other.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, well, we're looking for more questions. Maybe some students also? Yeah, that you look like a student.
Thanks. Fascinating discussions today. I'm a little surprised how little renewables were mentioned. We talked a lot about replacing coal with gas, but we haven't really talked about replacing coal with wind. And obviously there are a lot of technical, economic, and political barriers between where we are now and high penetrations of renewables, but I would just like to hear a little bit more from our panelists about the role they play.
Adam, I'm looking at you.
Sure, yeah. So I don't do a lot directly with renewables. I advise some students and certainly teach students, and particularly in my optimization class, who work with Professor Margot Gerritsen and other places on campus on renewable integration. You know, I guess I see this as a long-term transition. Energy history teaches us that, you know, transitions from, you know, largely being dependent on one type of energy to largely being dependent on another are typically multi-generational affairs, 50 years, 100 years. And we're sort of partway through that, and we're really now seeing renewables start to take off after sort of 20 or 30 years of kind of incubation. So we're really at an exciting point. You know, I think there's a lot to be done, and there is a lot being done on the Stanford campus with respect to computational optimization of the grid, integration of better integration of uncertain or stochastic resources onto the grid, better ways to mitigate the uncertainty associated with that. You know, that said, I think natural gas is going to continue to play a key role in the future, in particular because it's so easy to make it responsive to smooth out some of these irregularities. And some work here at GSEP has shown that that's likely, even under situations of a pretty high carbon tax, natural gas is likely to be the cheapest way to essentially offset the variability of these high renewable penetration scenarios. So you may have a situation where we've got a lot of renewables and a fair amount of natural gas to balance them out, and they effectively act like a sort of a baseload resource. And it sort of affects, it acts sort of as a storage type mechanism or sort of a balancing type mechanism. So I think there's a role for natural gas in the future. But yeah, obviously renewables are growing incredibly fast and are going to be, much more important in the future.
Yeah, so we heard a little bit about solar PV, of course, today, and there seemed to be good news is that economically that's very feasible right now. Wind is also growing tremendously, when you look at the growth rates in the last decade or so. One of the questions that came up when I was talking to people informally here related to this was this whole idea of, well, if we invest so much into natural gas and shale gas, are we fooling ourselves into thinking that that could stay just a bridge, blue or whatever color it would be, to a green energy future? And so the question really is, and I'm looking at you again, Adam, maybe Don has some ideas about this too, feel free to chime in, but if we invest so much, is the natural gas industry going to say 20 years from now, okay, we'll take a step back and let renewables take over? How dangerous in that sense is investing heavily in this infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, of course. I think there's a lot of room for gas to grow. There's a lot of coal to displace before this starts to be in effect. I think one of the really interesting things about, and I'll talk a little bit about something I'm working on, one of the really interesting things about the gas picture is the potential for leakage of gas to essentially offset some of the benefits that we might think of gas having from a climate perspective. I'm currently leading a team of about 15 people from universities and national labs around the country, and we're doing the most comprehensive assessment to date of about 25 years of literature on natural gas leakage. And it's a really interesting problem, right? And so I don't want to say that gas is sort of the solution for everything, because what we're finding in this study is that There's a fair amount of evidence from a variety of angles that leakage could be higher than we think it is. And of course, this affects the climate benefits of gas. And so, there's the potential that the bridge, if gas is a bridge to a renewable future, it may be a little longer than we might like. It may be a little bit more narrow of a bridge. We may have to traverse it carefully, right? Monitor leakage, be really careful and diligent about making sure that we're not having high leakage rates. But I think these are manageable problems, and it seems to me if it's done right, at least, and this may involve carbon capture and storage or something in the far future, gas could be a part of the portfolio for quite a long time.
More questions? Yeah, Sally.
Okay, I want to take us back to Earth Day. And, if I think back a long time ago, there was a wonderful statement that said, think globally and act locally. And when I listen to this discussion and I think about the policy making, I think we're now in a situation where we think locally, and because of the importance of the United States to the global economy, we have global impact. So we're thinking locally and acting globally. And I guess my question is to all of you is how can we reshape the conversation so we get back to the idea that we need to think globally and act locally?
Ross, you want to start us off?
Would you like to start, Sally?
Thinking globally is very challenging, right? And I think that's why people, and I don't know, Margot, you might have an opinion on this. You've talked to a lot of people in the energy world over the years, as part of your podcasts and your other activities. I mean, I think thinking globally is just inherently challenging. And so I think expecting us to make reasonable decisions on global problems is very hard. And a lot of these disjunctures align when the decisions we make due to local information, like you said, have these negative impacts from a broader perspective that we don't realize because we think we're making a good decision based on our local information, but in fact that wasn't the right decision. We just didn't quite realize it. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't even know if you expected an answer. I think it was sort of a rhetorical question, but you're trying to poke me into an answer of some sort. But Margot must have an opinion on this. I don't know.
It depends. It's so different when you're in different parts of the world. If I transplant myself to Stockholm right now, it's a really different way of thinking in the Scandinavian countries because they really are. They're small. They're very homogeneous, so they have a lot less to deal with than we do in this country in terms of all these needs and employment and energy. But they really do think locally and provide a much larger part of their budget for food and innovation in other countries and so forth. So it's really interesting to juxtapose those two things. For example, in Sweden, they're thinking of having tax on like meat or, for the carbon aspects of meat. They're down to that level of how do we control our own consumption to have this global good. Well, you can do that when you're in this teeny little homogeneous country and it's so much more difficult. But I don't think it's impossible. It's not impossible. And I think the way that we're going to see it in this country is through our cities, actually. I think there are going to be city initiatives that take hold, not national initiatives. And I think if you look around the country at different city initiatives, there's a lot to be proud of, actually. And so I think that should be our starting point, actually.
Yeah. So this is wonderful, but it is almost 5:30, and I'm the timekeeper. But it brings me to maybe a last point to ask all of you. One of the things that I hear a lot when I talk to people about energy is, well, China and India are such big problems. What would it even matter whether or not I think myself, and do if I save a little bit and I don't have a very long shower, or, I don't water my lawn, or I don't use a dryer, what impact does it make? So to end this with a positive note, maybe all of you can tell me, what is your favorite local individual thing that you do to help out? Either with food or water or energy or climate. Roz.
Well, I'll put a super controversial one on the table. I decided to have one child.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to be controversial, but I was influenced by Paul Ehrlich at the time. But I have to admit, you feel quite vulnerable having one child. So I won't say it's all positive.
I'll share that. I'll share that with
She's
you.
great, though.
By the way, Adam, I know you have one child now. I put you on the spot. You're going to have more?
I don't know. I'm much more, actually, I'm much more, so we brought up sort of compounding competencies before. I'm actually more and more optimistic about the future of humanity the more I study these things. There are environmental problems, but I think our rate of innovation and sort of ingenuity is increasing so much with information technology and the spread of education. So I think, globally, I don't know. I guess I'm not as pessimistic as I used to be. I do lots of stuff on an everyday basis. Most days I ride my bike to work. That's my favorite thing. In life, I always go for sort of things that are 2 for 1 or 3 for 1. So if you ride your bike to work, you get some exercise and you reduce your oil use. Two things I care about, and so you look for these opportunities in your life to try and get a 2 for 1 bargain. And I don't know. I like these sorts of things.
I'm operating to liberate Adam from the need to take a position with respect to his fatherhood. But I'm learning.
Did you notice I didn't bring it up?
I'm learning so much from him by occasionally consulting him that he's making his contribution that way only. I hope I haven't let him down and don't let him down again in the future. And as for an icon for thinking globally and acting locally, what better icon there is than Norway?
Expand on that.
It's just an amazing place in which it is contributing so much good to other people's systems and other places' systems that it's really hard to imagine. I mean, if you add up what they're doing in order to spread their own resource and research competence around the world and act in ways that extraordinarily benefit other nations. It's a wonderful example of how countries and individuals and cities and whatever could act to make the world better.
Right. Any Norwegians in the audience? See? Well, there you go. Oh, great. Well, I'm sure you have many, many more questions, but I've got good news. We have refreshments out there, and people will hang around, and you can ask those questions to them one-on-one. Before we really break up, I just wanted to thank the organizers for today, particularly Lee and Mickey and Sunny. I don't know if they're around, but there's many, many, many people from the Precor Institute and Tomcat and the Woods Institute that helped put this day together. So thanks to all of them. And thank you for joining us.